Battle of Stalingrad, 1942 to 1943, Soviet Union. The brutal urban siege. The Battle of Stalingrad stands as one of the bloodiest and most pivotal engagements of World War II. From August 23, 1942, to February 2, 1943, the industrial city of Stalingrad became the stage for a grinding, city-wide war that would change the course of the Eastern Front and alter the trajectory of the entire conflict. It was a battle of attrition, strategy, and unimaginable human suffering, where both soldiers and civilians endured conditions that tested the limits of endurance and morale. When the German Sixth Army, under General Friedrich Paulus, advanced into southern Russia in the summer of 1942, Hitler envisioned capturing Stalingrad as both a strategic and symbolic prize. The city sat on the Volga River, a critical supply route, and bore the name of the Soviet leader, Joseph Stalin, making its capture a blow to Soviet morale and propaganda. German High Command believed a rapid offensive would crush Soviet resistance and secure the oil-rich Caucasus. However, the Soviets had other plans. Stalin ordered the city to be held at all costs, turning civilians and soldiers alike into defenders of every street, building, and factory. Urban warfare defined Stalingrad. Unlike open-field battles, where armored divisions could maneuver freely, the city's factories, apartment blocks, and rubble-strewn streets turned every corner into a killing ground. Soviet defenders transformed factories into fortified strongpoints, snipers lurked in ruins, and every building became a potential death trap. Tanks and artillery were often of limited use in the tight streets, forcing close-quarters combat that favored sheer determination and ingenuity. House-to-house fighting became the norm, with soldiers battling for single rooms, basements, and stairwells. The human cost was staggering. Estimates suggest over 2 million people were killed, wounded, or captured during the months-long siege, including soldiers and civilians. The Luftwaffe conducted continuous bombing raids, leveling entire districts, yet Soviet resilience remained unbroken. Civilians endured starvation, freezing temperatures, and relentless bombardment, yet many stayed in the city, supporting troops with food, medical aid, and even improvised defenses. The phrase "not a step back," issued in Stalin's orders, epitomized the brutal determination that defined Soviet strategy. Winter set in by late 1942, and the Germans, ill-prepared for the harsh Russian cold, faced deteriorating morale and supply shortages. In November, the Soviets launched Operation Uranus, a massive counteroffensive targeting the weaker Romanian and Hungarian forces guarding the flanks of the German Sixth Army. Encirclement quickly became reality, trapping roughly 300,000 Axis troops inside the city. Paulus, once confident of victory, now faced starvation, extreme cold, and relentless Soviet attacks. Despite Hitler's insistence that he hold Stalingrad at all costs, the Sixth Army's situation became hopeless. The surrender on February 2, 1943, marked the first major defeat of Hitler's army and sent shockwaves through the Axis powers. Nearly 91,000 German troops were captured, though few survived the harsh Soviet captivity. Stalingrad became a symbol of resilience, a turning point where the initiative on the Eastern Front passed decisively to the Soviets. It shattered the myth of German invincibility, inspired Allied forces worldwide, and proved that determination, strategy, and endurance could overcome technological superiority. Beyond statistics and military maneuvers, Stalingrad was a battle that redefined modern urban warfare. The close-quarters combat, integration of snipers, tanks, artillery, and even civilian participation, became a model studied for decades. The psychological impact was equally profound. Soldiers endured unspeakable horrors, and survivors carried memories of devastation and heroism that would shape post-war narratives and Soviet national identity. In the grand tapestry of World War II, the Battle of Stalingrad is remembered not just for the number of lives lost, but for the unrelenting human spirit that refused to yield. It was a testament to the extreme costs of total war and a stark reminder that strategic vision alone cannot win a battle without the courage, determination, and sacrifice of those on the ground. Stalingrad was not merely a city, it was a crucible. It was fire, ice, steel, and blood forged together in the harshest of human trials. And when the smoke cleared, the world knew the tide of war on the Eastern Front had shifted forever. Battle of Normandy/D-Day, 1944, France. The massive amphibious invasion. On June 6, 1944, the world witnessed one of the most ambitious and meticulously planned military operations in history, Operation Overlord, better known as D-Day. The Battle of Normandy was not merely a landing on enemy-held beaches, it was the opening salvo of the liberation of Western Europe, a colossal endeavor that required unparalleled coordination between armies, navies, and air forces from across the Allied nations. The stakes could not have been higher. Hitler's Atlantic Wall was formidable, German forces were entrenched and battle-hardened, and the Allies had to gamble everything on a single day to turn the tide in the West. The planning for Normandy began years in advance. The Allies had to deceive the Germans about the true invasion location, develop landing craft capable of transporting men, vehicles, and supplies onto heavily fortified beaches, and train troops for amphibious assaults and inland combat. Intelligence, espionage, and even fake equipment played crucial roles in making the Germans believe the attack might come at Pas-de-Calais, rather than Normandy. When dawn broke on June 6, more than 156,000 Allied troops were poised to storm 5 beaches: Utah, Omaha, Gold, Juno, and Sword. The first wave of paratroopers dropped inland in the early hours, tasked with seizing bridges, roadways, and key defensive points. Behind them came thousands of naval vessels, carrying infantry, tanks, artillery, and supplies directly onto beaches under withering fire. At Omaha Beach, for example, German machine guns and artillery raked the coastline, cutting down waves of soldiers even before they could reach the sand. Despite these overwhelming odds, courage and determination carried the day. Soldiers used hedgerows, craters, and wreckage to advance under relentless fire, exemplifying bravery in the face of near-impossible odds. Air superiority played a crucial role in D-Day. Bombers and fighters suppressed German defenses and disrupted reinforcements, while gliders and paratroopers created chaos behind enemy lines. Yet even with meticulous planning, casualties were heavy. Estimates suggest that the Allies suffered over 10,000 casualties, including more than 4,000 killed on the first day alone. German losses were also significant, though their defensive positions and the element of surprise had been eroded by the Allies' overwhelming preparation. Once the beaches were secured, the Allies faced the formidable task of breaking out of the narrow Normandy lodgment. The Bocage countryside, dense hedgerows and narrow lanes, favored defenders, turning every village and field into a potential ambush site. The fighting was brutal, with tanks, infantry, and artillery engaged in close-quarters combat. Cities such as Cannes and Cherbourg became focal points of weeks-long battles, and logistical challenges meant that every truckload of supplies was vital for sustaining the offensive. Normandy's strategic significance was immense. Securing a foothold on French soil allowed the Allies to establish supply lines, bring in reinforcements, and launch further operations into occupied Europe. It forced Germany to divert troops from the Eastern Front, weakened the Atlantic Wall, and demonstrated the overwhelming coordination and industrial capacity of the Allied powers. The liberation of France had begun, and the momentum toward Germany itself became unstoppable. Beyond military statistics, D-Day became a symbol of unity, courage, and sacrifice. Soldiers from the United States, Britain, Canada, and other nations fought together, supported by naval crews, airmen, and engineers who ensured the beaches could sustain a rapid buildup. Civilians witnessed devastation, yet also glimpsed hope as Allied forces advanced. The battle was a turning point not only strategically but morally. It signaled that the liberation of Europe was achievable through coordinated action, bravery, and sheer resolve. The Battle of Normandy reminds us that victory in war often depends on preparation, intelligence, courage, and the willingness to face overwhelming odds. From the storming of the beaches to the hard-fought inland campaigns, the operation combined audacity and precision. It is remembered not just for the scale of forces involved or the tactical brilliance, but for the human endurance, sacrifice, and heroism that defined the operation. D-Day was more than a military maneuver. It was a turning point in the struggle for freedom in Europe, the day when hope broke through the iron grip of occupation. The beaches of Normandy, soaked in blood and valor, became the stage where the liberation of an entire continent began. The Battle of Normandy was not only massive in scale but monumental in its impact, a decisive step toward ending the Second World War in Europe. Battle of Okinawa, 1945, Japan, the last major island battle in the Pacific. The Battle of Okinawa, fought from April 1 to June 22, 1945, was the largest amphibious assault in the Pacific theater during World War II and a harrowing glimpse of the brutal reality of island warfare. Often referred to as the Typhoon of Steel, Okinawa was not just a military campaign. It was a crucible of human endurance, ingenuity, and tragedy, a battle that foreshadowed the unimaginable costs that an invasion of the Japanese home islands would entail. Okinawa, the largest of the Ryukyu Islands, held strategic significance. Its location provided a base for Allied forces to launch air raids and naval operations against the Japanese mainland. For the Japanese, the island was the last line of defense, a bastion where they could inflict maximum casualties and buy time to prepare for the anticipated invasion of Japan. Unlike other Pacific islands, Okinawa had civilian populations numbering over 300,000, who would tragically become entangled in the fighting. The battle began with a massive Allied amphibious landing on April 1, 1945, codenamed Operation Iceberg. Over 180,000 U.S. troops stormed the beaches, supported by thousands of ships and hundreds of aircraft. From the outset, Japanese defenders employed determined, deeply entrenched strategies, including fortified positions, caves, and tunnels that turned hills and ridges into killing zones. Artillery, mortars, and machine guns rained down on advancing soldiers, making each footstep forward a deadly gamble. Unlike many previous battles, Okinawa featured relentless kamikaze attacks by Japanese pilots. Hundreds of aircraft deliberately crashed into Allied ships, inflicting catastrophic damage and sinking dozens of vessels. Naval crews faced a constant threat from the skies, and the combination of artillery, airstrikes, and suicide attacks made the waters around Okinawa among the most dangerous of the entire war. The psychological toll was immense, as sailors and soldiers watched comrades perish in waves of both conventional and suicidal assaults. The fighting on land was equally harrowing. U.S. forces encountered rocky terrain, fortified hills, and dense forests, all of which favored Japanese defensive tactics. The battle quickly devolved into grueling house-to-house and cave-to-cave combat, with small units repeatedly risking their lives to clear entrenched positions. Casualties were staggering. Over 49,000 Allied soldiers were killed, wounded, or missing, while Japanese military losses exceeded 77,000, and tens of thousands of civilians perished. The sheer intensity of the combat made Okinawa one of the deadliest engagements of the Pacific War. The civilian toll added an additional layer of tragedy. Many Okinawans were caught between the two forces, coerced or compelled by Japanese military authorities to remain in combat zones. Tens of thousands died in crossfire, bombings, and massacres, while others took their own lives under the fear of capture, indoctrinated by propaganda about Allied atrocities. The human cost was immense and often overlooked in the strategic calculations of war. Despite these obstacles, U.S. forces gradually advanced, utilizing combined arms strategies: infantry, tanks, artillery, naval bombardments, and air support. By June, the Allies had captured key positions, including the fortified Shuri Line, effectively breaking Japanese defensive capability. On June 22, 1945, organized Japanese resistance ended, though isolated holdouts continued to fight. The battle had left Okinawa devastated, cities leveled, farmland ruined, and tens of thousands of lives extinguished. Strategically, Okinawa was pivotal. Its capture provided the Allies with airfields and staging areas critical for the planned invasion of Japan. Yet the battle also served as a grim warning. If the Japanese homeland were to be invaded, casualties on both sides would likely surpass those already witnessed on Okinawa. It was this realization that, in part, influenced the decision to deploy atomic bombs later that year, seeking to avoid a protracted and bloody land invasion. The Battle of Okinawa is remembered not just for its staggering numbers, but for the extreme ferocity, endurance, and human suffering it embodied. Soldiers endured relentless attacks, civilians were trapped in catastrophic conditions, and both sides faced the limits of human endurance. The battle became a symbol of the Pacific War's brutality, the desperation of the defenders, and the cost of victory. Okinawa was more than a battle. It was a testament to courage, tenacity, and the devastating reality of modern warfare. It marked the final major land engagement of World War II, and its lessons in strategy, sacrifice, and human cost would echo far beyond the Pacific Islands, shaping both military planning and historical memory for generations. Battle of Kursk, 1943, Soviet Union. The largest tank battle in history. The Battle of Kursk, fought between July 5 and August 23, 1943, stands as one of the most significant engagements of World War II. It was not only the largest tank battle in history, but also a decisive turning point on the Eastern Front, signaling the shift of initiative from the Germans to the Soviets. Kursk was a battle defined by meticulous preparation, overwhelming industrial capacity, and the clash of armored forces on a scale never before seen in warfare. After the catastrophic defeat at Stalingrad, Hitler sought to regain momentum in the east. The Germans devised Operation Citadel, aiming to pinch the massive Soviet salient around Kursk with a double envelopment. They intended to crush the Soviets decisively, eliminate reserves, and restore German offensive initiative. For the Soviets, however, Kursk presented an opportunity not just to defend but to annihilate the German armored threat once and for all. Stalin and his generals meticulously prepared, turning the salient into a fortress of defenses. Mines, anti-tank ditches, fortified bunkers, and artillery positions were laid with remarkable precision, while reserves were concentrated for a devastating counteroffensive. The battle began with a massive German assault from the north and south of the salient. Over 6,000 tanks, 4,000 aircraft, and 2 million men were engaged in the fighting. On the northern front, the Germans met fierce resistance and were slowed by Soviet depth defenses. In the south, the engagement at Prokhorovka became legendary. Hundreds of tanks from both sides clashed in an inferno of steel and fire. The scale was almost unimaginable. Tanks, artillery, and infantry were locked in close combat, with anti-tank weapons and minefields shaping the battlefield as heavily as strategy and skill. Soviet defenses and counterattacks were meticulously timed. By mid-July, German advances had slowed drastically, taking heavy losses in men and material. Soviet reserves, fresh and strategically positioned, struck back with relentless force, turning the battle into a war of attrition that the Germans could not sustain. German tanks, such as the formidable Tiger I and Panther, inflicted damage but were unable to break the Soviet lines completely. Mechanical failures, fuel shortages, and relentless artillery fire compounded the German difficulties, showcasing the limits of technology when facing a prepared, resilient defense. The human cost of Kursk was staggering. Estimates suggest over 250,000 German casualties and over 800,000 Soviet casualties, including killed, wounded, and missing. Thousands of tanks and aircraft were destroyed on both sides, with Soviet forces ultimately gaining superiority in numbers and resources. Yet the battle was not just about statistics. It was about the strategic shift it represented. After Kursk, Germany would largely remain on the defensive on the Eastern Front, while the Soviets launched a series of offensives that would carry them all the way to Berlin 2 years later. Kursk also demonstrated the evolution of modern armored warfare. Combined arms coordination between tanks, artillery, infantry, and aircraft was essential, while engineering ingenuity, minefields, defensive works, and layered positions proved decisive. The battle became a case study in the importance of preparation, intelligence, and the integration of multiple military branches in large-scale operations. Psychologically, Kursk shattered the aura of German invincibility. The Wehrmacht, which had conquered Europe with astonishing speed, now faced an enemy capable of absorbing blows, counterattacking decisively, and leveraging industrial strength to achieve victory. The Soviet Union's capacity to rebuild and sustain such a massive defensive and offensive operation demonstrated a strategic depth that Germany could not overcome. In retrospect, the Battle of Kursk was more than a clash of tanks. It was a decisive moment of strategic transition in World War II. It marked the end of German offensive dominance in the East and the beginning of a relentless Soviet push westward. The battle highlighted the interplay of preparation, tactical innovation, and sheer human courage, and it remains an enduring symbol of the scale and intensity of the conflict on the Eastern Front. Kursk was a crucible of armored warfare, firepower, and human endurance. It was a battle where strategy met overwhelming force, where the German blitzkrieg finally met its match, and where the Soviets demonstrated that resilience, preparation, and determination could tip the scales of history. Battle of Berlin, 1945 Germany, the final assault on the Nazi capital. The Battle of Berlin, fought from April 16 to May 2, 1945, was the final climactic confrontation of the European theater in World War II. It was a battle that pitted the full might of the Soviet Red Army against the remnants of a defeated Wehrmacht, and it ultimately brought the Third Reich to its knees. Unlike the sweeping open-field maneuvers that had characterized much of the war, Berlin's streets became a confined, chaotic battlefield, where urban warfare, artillery barrages, and house-to-house combat defined the struggle for every block and building. By April 1945, Germany was in strategic collapse. Allied forces were advancing from the west, Soviet armies were pressing from the east, and Hitler's command structure was crumbling under pressure. Yet in Berlin, a combination of ideology, desperation, and fear fueled a fierce last stand. The Soviets, under Marshals Georgy Zhukov and Ivan Konyev, amassed over 2.5 million men, supported by more than 6,000 tanks and 7,500 aircraft, to encircle and capture the city. German defenders, numbering approximately 766,000, included regular army troops, Volkssturmmilitia, Hitler Youth, and SS units, all fighting to delay the inevitable. The Red Army began its assault with intense artillery bombardments, leveling buildings and creating a shattered urban landscape. Soviet engineers cleared obstacles, while infantry moved methodically through streets, alleys, and destroyed buildings. Urban warfare meant that every building was a potential fortress. Apartments, factories, and even subway tunnels became defensive positions. Snipers, machine guns, and Panzerfaust teams inflicted heavy casualties on advancing Soviet units, turning the city into a deadly labyrinth. Civilian populations were caught in the crossfire. Berlin's residents endured starvation, bombings, and indiscriminate street fighting, and tens of thousands were killed or wounded during the battle. Many fled to the countryside, while others were trapped in basements and shelters as artillery and tank fire transformed entire neighborhoods into rubble. The human suffering was immense, reflecting the tragic cost of total war in a densely populated urban environment. By late April, Soviet forces had penetrated the city center, engaging in brutal combat around landmarks such as the Reichstag, Tiergarten, and the Brandenburg Gate. Each Soviet advance required clearing buildings room by room, street by street. German defenders, aware of the futility of resistance, nonetheless fought with fanatical determination, often committing themselves to suicide attacks or last-stand engagements rather than surrendering. The psychological intensity of the battle, combined with relentless bombardment, created a scene of apocalyptic destruction and chaos. Amid the destruction, Adolf Hitler remained in his bunker beneath the Reich Chancellery, issuing orders that had little practical effect and refusing to accept the inevitability of defeat. On April 30, 1945, Hitler committed suicide, effectively marking the symbolic end of Nazi Germany. Despite this, German forces continued fighting sporadically until May 2, when General Helmuth Weidling formally surrendered Berlin to the Soviets. The battle had decimated the city, with estimates of over 100,000 German soldiers killed and more than 125,000 civilians dead. Soviet casualties numbered around 80,000 killed and 200,000 wounded, reflecting the ferocity of the engagement. Strategically, the Battle of Berlin had immense significance. It eliminated the last major Nazi stronghold, ended Hitler's regime, and paved the way for the occupation and division of Germany. It demonstrated the destructive power of modern urban warfare, where tanks, artillery, infantry, and civilians were all intertwined in a deadly mosaic. The battle also underscored the importance of logistics, planning, and overwhelming force in securing victory, as Soviet numerical superiority and tactical coordination eventually overcame determined German resistance. The legacy of Berlin is both heroic and tragic. It was a battle of extreme valor, sacrifice, and horror, marking the end of one of history's most devastating conflicts in Europe. Entire neighborhoods were obliterated, and the city had to be rebuilt from ruins. Yet the victory symbolized the end of tyranny and the possibility of reconstruction and peace. The Battle of Berlin was more than a military confrontation. It was the collapse of an ideology, the triumph of strategic perseverance, and the final decisive blow that ended Nazi Germany's reign of terror. Its streets bore witness to courage, despair, and the immense cost of war, leaving a mark that history would never forget. Battle of Leningrad, 1941 to 1944, Soviet Union, the Siege of Endurance and Suffering. The Siege of Leningrad, lasting from September 8, 1941, to January 27, 1944, stands as one of the longest and most devastating sieges in human history. For nearly 900 days, the city's inhabitants endured unimaginable hardship as German and Finnish forces encircled Leningrad, cutting off supplies and attempting to starve the city into submission. This siege was not only a military campaign but a test of human resilience, determination, and the unyielding spirit of a population under siege. Leningrad, now St. Petersburg, was a city of immense strategic and symbolic importance. It was a cultural hub, an industrial center, and a major port on the Baltic Sea. Hitler considered its capture essential for both military and ideological reasons. Taking Leningrad would crush Soviet morale and secure the Northern Front. German forces, alongside Finnish troops, sought to encircle the city completely, using artillery bombardments, air raids, and ground forces to isolate and weaken the defenders. From the very beginning, the siege brought extreme suffering. Cut off from food, fuel, and medical supplies, Leningrad's population of over 2 million faced starvation, disease, and relentless bombardment. Rations dwindled to bare minimums, often below 200 calories per day, forcing residents to eat anything available, from pets to leather goods, and even boiling wallpaper paste for sustenance. Yet despite these conditions, the city refused to surrender. Soviet troops and civilians alike displayed extraordinary courage, organizing defenses, building fortifications, and maintaining essential services under constant threat. The Red Army established supply routes across Lake Ladoga, known as the Road of Life, which allowed limited deliveries of food and evacuation of civilians during winter months when the lake froze. This lifeline became a symbol of hope, yet it was fraught with danger, as German artillery and air attacks targeted convoys, making every crossing a life-or-death endeavor. Civilians and soldiers alike braved freezing temperatures, shellfire, and hunger to maintain the city's survival. Throughout the siege, German forces attempted multiple offensives to capture the city outright, but Soviet fortifications, determined defense, and urban resilience repeatedly repelled these attacks. Artillery bombardments flattened neighborhoods, but the inhabitants refused to abandon their homes. Factories continued producing weapons and equipment for the war effort, hospitals treated the sick with minimal resources, and cultural life, though diminished, persisted to maintain morale. Casualties during the siege were staggering. Estimates suggest that over 1 million civilians died, primarily from starvation, while tens of thousands of soldiers perished defending the city. Disease, extreme cold, and malnutrition compounded the suffering, yet Leningrad endured. The city's survival became a powerful symbol of Soviet resilience and defiance, inspiring the Red Army to intensify counteroffensives against German positions. The siege finally ended in January 1944, when Soviet forces broke the German encirclement and liberated the city. By that time, Leningrad had been transformed, streets lay in ruins, families had been decimated, and infrastructure was shattered. Yet the spirit of the city remained unbroken. The survivors had endured nearly 900 days of unimaginable hardship, embodying the principle that human courage and determination could withstand even the most ruthless assault. Strategically, the survival of Leningrad was critical. It denied Germany a key industrial and symbolic prize, tied down vast numbers of German troops who could have been deployed elsewhere, and provided a morale boost to the Soviet Union and the Allies. The siege highlighted not only the horrors of war but also the capacity of civilians to endure, organize, and contribute to military resistance under extreme circumstances. The Battle of Leningrad is remembered not only as a military engagement but as a testament to human resilience in the face of adversity. It showed that cities could endure prolonged assault when the population remained united, disciplined, and determined to survive. The story of Leningrad stands as a chilling reminder of war's brutality, yet also as a symbol of endurance, courage, and the unbreakable spirit of a besieged people. Battle of Iwo Jima, 1945, Japan, the iconic island fight. The Battle of Iwo Jima, fought from February 19 to March 26, 1945, was one of the most intense and iconic battles of the Pacific Theater. Situated roughly 750 miles south of Tokyo, the tiny volcanic island held outsized strategic importance. It provided airfields for American bombers and emergency landing sites for damaged aircraft returning from raids over Japan. Both sides understood the stakes, and the ensuing battle became a brutal test of endurance, courage, and the grim realities of island warfare. For the Japanese defenders, Iwo Jima was a fortress in miniature. Under the command of Lieutenant General Tadamaki Kuribayashi, approximately 21,000 Japanese troops prepared for a fight to the death. They constructed an extensive network of bunkers, tunnels, and hidden artillery positions, taking advantage of the island's rugged terrain and volcanic ridges. Kuribayashi rejected traditional beach defenses, instead opting for defense in depth, allowing the Americans to land before drawing them into lethal, concealed fire zones. Every hill, cave, and ridgeline was a potential death trap, making progress costly and slow. On February 19, 1945, over 70,000 U.S. Marines landed on Iwo Jima under heavy naval and aerial bombardment. Despite intense pre-landing shelling, Japanese forces had survived the initial strikes, emerging from hidden fortifications to unleash devastating machine gun, mortar, and artillery fire on advancing troops. The beaches quickly became slaughter zones, and for many Marines, the first steps on Iwo Jima were among the deadliest moments of their war. Casualties mounted rapidly, with waves of soldiers confronting hidden bunkers, camouflaged pillboxes, and precise sniper fire. The battle was characterized by grinding, attritional combat. American forces advanced slowly, often at the cost of dozens of lives per hill or ridge. Tanks struggled in the island's volcanic ash, and flamethrowers, explosives, and close-quarters combat became essential tools to dislodge defenders from fortified positions. Japanese troops rarely surrendered, adhering to a doctrine of fight to the death, using tunnels to appear behind advancing Marines and striking unexpectedly. The intensity of the fighting created a battle environment unlike any other in the Pacific, where every step forward was paid for in blood. One of the most enduring images of the battle came from Mount Suribachi, the island's highest point. After days of fierce combat, U.S. Marines captured the mountaintop on February 23, raising the American flag in a moment immortalized by Joe Rosenthal's iconic photograph. The flag raising symbolized determination and hope amidst immense human suffering, though the fighting continued across the island for nearly a month. By the time the battle ended on March 26, 1945, casualties were staggering. U.S. forces suffered over 26,000 casualties, including more than 6,800 killed. Japanese defenders were almost entirely annihilated, with only about 200 soldiers taken prisoner out of 21,000. The extreme losses on both sides reflected the ferocity of the engagement and the island's strategic importance in the closing months of the Pacific War. The strategic impact of Iwo Jima was significant. Capturing the island provided the U.S. military with airfields to support B-29 bombing campaigns against Japan, allowing damaged bombers to land safely and extend the reach of air operations. It also demonstrated the devastating costs of assaulting well-fortified Japanese positions, informing later plans for potential invasions of the Japanese home islands and influencing the eventual decision to deploy atomic weapons. The Battle of Iwo Jima is remembered not only for its tactical and strategic significance, but for the sheer heroism and sacrifice displayed. Marines endured intense fire, relentless terrain challenges, and daily losses to secure a critical objective. Japanese defenders displayed unwavering courage, fighting to the last man with extraordinary tenacity. The battle symbolized the brutal nature of Pacific warfare and the staggering human costs of securing victory. Iwo Jima remains an enduring symbol of courage, sacrifice, and the high stakes of World War II. Its story reminds us that even the smallest piece of land can become the stage for monumental human struggle, where strategy, fortitude, and resolve define history itself. Battle of the Bulge, 1944 to 1945, Belgium/Luxembourg/Germany, Hitler's last gamble. The Battle of the Bulge, fought from December 16, 1944, to January 25, 1945, was Adolf Hitler's final desperate attempt to turn the tide on the Western Front. By late 1944, Allied forces had liberated much of France and were advancing into Germany. Facing dwindling options, Hitler devised a bold plan: launch a surprise counteroffensive through the densely forested Ardennes region of Belgium and Luxembourg, aiming to split the Allied lines, capture the vital port of Antwerp, and force a negotiated peace in the West. What followed became the largest and bloodiest battle fought by the United States during World War II. The German plan relied heavily on surprise, speed, and the difficult terrain of the Ardennes. Winter conditions, snow, fog, and freezing temperatures, were seen as advantageous, masking troop movements and hindering Allied air reconnaissance. Approximately 200,000 German soldiers, supported by 1,000 tanks and 1,500 aircraft, launched the assault, catching the Allies off guard. Initial advances were dramatic. Columns of German panzers and infantry carved deep into American lines, creating a pronounced bulge in the front that gave the battle its name. American forces, initially thinly spread and underprepared for winter combat, faced chaos. Supply lines were disrupted, communications faltered, and units were isolated in forested terrain. The 101st Airborne at Bastogne became emblematic of Allied resistance, holding the town despite being encircled and outnumbered. Their determined defense, famously refusing to surrender, delayed German advances and bought crucial time for reinforcements to arrive. Brigadier General Anthony McAuliffe's legendary reply, "Nuts," to a German surrender demand became a symbol of American resolve under dire circumstances. The battle's intensity was compounded by harsh winter conditions. Soldiers endured freezing temperatures, snowstorms, and frostbite, while artillery and tank engagements raged continuously. Every village, road, and hill became a contested battlefield. German tanks, including Tiger IIs and Panthers, pushed forward aggressively, but mechanical failures, fuel shortages, and fierce resistance slowed their progress. Air support, limited at first by weather, eventually played a decisive role once skies cleared, allowing Allied aircraft to attack German columns and supply lines relentlessly. Casualties were immense. The Allies suffered roughly 89,000 killed, wounded, or missing, with tens of thousands more German casualties, estimated around 100,000 to 125,000, including soldiers lost to combat and exposure. Civilians in Belgium and Luxembourg also endured hardship as towns were destroyed, homes burned, and populations displaced. Despite the staggering human cost, the battle demonstrated the resilience, adaptability, and determination of the Allied forces. Strategically, the Battle of the Bulge failed in its objectives. While German forces achieved initial successes and caused panic among Allied commanders, they could not sustain their advance. Fuel shortages, stiffening American resistance, and the eventual arrival of reinforcements turned the tide. By late January 1945, German troops were pushed back, and the front lines were restored. The battle exhausted Germany's remaining reserves, weakened its offensive capability, and hastened the Allied invasion into the heart of Germany. The Battle of the Bulge remains a defining moment in World War II for several reasons. It was the last major German offensive, representing the desperate gamble of a regime in decline. It highlighted the importance of terrain, surprise, and logistics in modern warfare, as well as the extreme endurance required of soldiers facing both human and environmental challenges. It also became a symbol of Allied resilience, heroism, and the ability to recover from setbacks under seemingly impossible conditions. In the end, the Bulge demonstrated that even under severe pressure, strategic depth, coordination, and morale could overcome temporary tactical surprises. It showcased the brutal realities of winter warfare in Europe and underscored the cost of Germany's strategic overreach. The failure of Hitler's last major offensive paved the way for the Allies' final advance into Germany, hastening the collapse of the Third Reich. Battle of El Alamein, 1942, Egypt, halting the Axis in North Africa. The Battle of El Alamein, fought in October-November 1942 near the Egyptian town of El Alamein, marked a crucial turning point in the North African campaign of World War II. For months, the German-Italian Panzer Army, led by Field Marshal Erwin Rommel, had pushed relentlessly across the desert, threatening Egypt, the Suez Canal, and access to vital Middle Eastern oil fields. The Allied forces, commanded by General Bernard Montgomery, prepared a decisive stand that would halt the Axis advance and shift the momentum in favor of the Allies. The geography of El Alamein played a key role in the battle. Situated between the Mediterranean Sea and the impassable Qattara Depression, the narrow front prevented Axis forces from flanking Allied positions, creating a battlefield conducive to defense. Montgomery utilized this terrain advantage, reinforcing the front lines with well-prepared defensive positions, minefields, and artillery placements. His strategy emphasized firepower, coordination, and attrition, ensuring that Rommel's forces would face a formidable obstacle in their advance. Rommel, known as the Desert Fox, had achieved a string of victories across North Africa, relying on maneuver warfare and lightning-fast attacks. However, by mid-1942, his supply lines were overstretched, fuel was scarce, and the Allies had begun to rebuild their strength. At El Alamein, Rommel attempted to break through the entrenched Allied defenses with concentrated armored assaults. German and Italian tanks clashed repeatedly with British artillery and anti-tank guns, while infantry units faced heavy bombardments and relentless fire. The battle was fought in relentless waves, with each side enduring extreme desert conditions, blistering days, freezing nights, and sandstorms that made visibility and movement challenging. Air superiority became a crucial factor, as the Royal Air Force dominated the skies, striking Axis supply lines and armored columns. Meanwhile, Allied logistical planning ensured that ammunition, fuel, and reinforcements flowed steadily to the front, enabling them to sustain the grueling fight over several weeks. A defining feature of El Alamein was the Allied use of combined arms tactics. Infantry, artillery, tanks, and air support worked in close coordination to wear down Axis attacks. Unlike previous battles in the desert, where maneuverability had been decisive, El Alamein showcased how firepower, preparation, and defensive strategy could blunt even the most audacious offensives. Rommel's attacks, though skillfully executed, were gradually neutralized, and casualties mounted. The final phase, known as Operation Supercharge, saw concentrated armored thrust by the Allies that broke the Axis lines, forcing Rommel to retreat westward. The defeat at El Alamein marked the first major decisive victory for the Allies in North Africa and ended German hopes of seizing the Suez Canal. For the Allies, it was a tremendous morale boost, demonstrating that Axis forces could be stopped and reversed, even after months of relentless desert warfare. Casualties were significant on both sides, with estimates of around 13,500 Allied and 30,000 Axis troops killed, wounded, or captured. Beyond the human cost, the battle had far-reaching strategic consequences. The victory paved the way for the Allied invasion of Tunisia, the eventual expulsion of Axis forces from North Africa, and the establishment of a launching point for the Sicily and Italian campaigns. It also elevated Montgomery to international prominence and cemented El Alamein in history as a symbol of disciplined strategy and the turning tide of the war. El Alamein demonstrated that meticulous planning, logistical superiority, and combined arms coordination could overcome even the most daring offensive maneuvers. It illustrated the importance of preparation, supply, and intelligence in modern warfare. The battle showcased the resilience of troops fighting in harsh desert conditions and highlighted the critical role of leadership in achieving decisive victories. In the broader context of World War II, El Alamein marked the beginning of the end for Axis ambitions in Africa. It underscored the limits of German operational reach and foreshadowed the eventual collapse of Axis positions across the Mediterranean. For the Allies, the victory symbolized hope, determination, and the strategic advantage that could be gained through preparation, coordination, and relentless pressure. The Battle of El Alamein remains an enduring testament to courage, strategy, and the ability of well-prepared forces to turn the tide against a formidable enemy, cementing its place as one of the deadliest and most pivotal battles of World War II. Battle of Guadalcanal, 1942 to 1943, Solomon Islands, the first major Allied offensive in the Pacific. The Battle of Guadalcanal, fought from August 7, 1942, to February 9, 1943, marked a crucial turning point in the Pacific theater. It was the first major Allied offensive against Japan, signaling a shift from defensive operations to a strategy of island hopping that would ultimately bring the war closer to Japan's home islands. Guadalcanal, part of the Solomon Islands chain, became the stage for some of the fiercest jungle, naval, and aerial combat of World War II, testing the endurance, courage, and ingenuity of all involved. The island's strategic importance lay in its airfield at Lunga Point, later named Henderson Field by the Allies. If Japan maintained control of Guadalcanal, its forces could threaten supply and communication lines between the United States, Australia, and New Zealand. Conversely, Allied control of the island would allow the Americans to establish a forward base for air and naval operations, projecting power deeper into Japanese-held territories. Recognizing this, the U.S. launched a bold amphibious invasion with Marine and Army units, supported by naval and air forces. From the outset, Guadalcanal was a grueling environment. Tropical heat, dense jungles, swamps, and disease, including malaria and dysentery, added layers of hardship to combat. Japanese defenders, numbering around 11,000 troops, had fortified the island with bunkers, artillery, and machine gun positions. They were skilled, disciplined, and determined, prepared to fight to the death to protect their strategic asset. American forces, landing with 19,000 Marines, faced the dual challenge of establishing control on land while defending against relentless naval and aerial counterattacks. The fighting quickly escalated into a war of attrition. On land, Marines and Japanese soldiers engaged in intense jungle combat, often at close quarters. Terrain and limited visibility made every advance costly, as ambushes and hidden artillery took a heavy toll. Battles like Tenere River and Bloody Ridge exemplified the savagery of the conflict, where both sides suffered heavy casualties in repeated brutal assaults. Survival often depended as much on endurance and improvisation as on training or firepower. Naval engagements around Guadalcanal were equally decisive. The island saw some of the largest and most intense naval battles of the Pacific War, including the Battle of Savo Island, where the Japanese Navy inflicted severe losses on Allied cruisers, and the Battle of Cape Esperance, which marked a crucial shift toward American naval dominance in the area. Control of the seas and skies was constantly contested, with aircraft from Henderson Field providing critical support to ground forces and harassing Japanese supply convoys, further tipping the balance over time. The prolonged struggle extended into harsh weather and supply shortages, intensifying the suffering of soldiers on both sides. Japanese troops faced starvation and isolation as Allied naval blockades prevented reinforcements and resupply. Meanwhile, American forces had to maintain their positions under constant threat while dealing with disease, fatigue, and the psychological toll of relentless combat. Despite these challenges, morale and determination remained high, driven by the strategic necessity of securing the island and establishing a foothold in the Pacific. By February 1943, after 6 months of brutal combat, Japanese forces were effectively evacuated or destroyed, marking the first major Allied victory in the Pacific. Casualties were staggering. Over 1,600 U.S. Marines killed and nearly 4,200 wounded, with Japanese losses estimated at over 20,000, including combat deaths, disease, and starvation. The victory at Guadalcanal not only secured the airfield for future operations, but also shattered the myth of Japanese invincibility, proving that Allied forces could mount sustained offensive operations deep in the Pacific. The battle's significance extended beyond its immediate tactical success. Guadalcanal set the stage for the island-hopping campaign, which brought Allied forces progressively closer to Japan. It forced Japan to divert troops, ships, and resources to desperate defensive operations, weakening their overall strategic position. Moreover, it demonstrated the importance of combined arms operations, with land, sea, and air forces coordinating effectively under extreme conditions. The Battle of Guadalcanal endures as a symbol of perseverance, courage, and strategic initiative. It showcased the ability of Allied forces to adapt to harsh environments, overcome logistical challenges, and sustain offensive momentum against a determined enemy. Guadalcanal proved that the war in the Pacific could be won, marking the beginning of a relentless push that would eventually lead to Japan's surrender in 1945.